Now, Chuck very bravely invited me to speak about worship. Oh, Bishop Murphy, I mustn't call him Chuck up here, should I? Is that wrong? Okay. I'm sorry. Start again there. Just rewind the tape a little bit. Bishop Murphy invited me to speak about worship. And he said, Andy, it'd be great if you give us a theology of worship to help us move forward. And I thought, what a fantastic invitation. So I thought, well, how could resist that? So I took a look at some of our great champions of the faith. I looked at some of the Reformation champions. And so what's their approach to the theology of worship? And so I looked at Luther. And Luther's approach seemed to be anything goes. As long as it's in the language of the people and the people understand it, we can take music from anywhere. Let's take folk songs, let's take show songs, let's make them work, let's add harmonies, you know, let's really sort of fire it up. You get the impression, being around Luther, that things were a lot of fun. I came across this quote from him, which I thought was great. It's a preface to, I think it was in front of a book anywhere. He says, this is Luther's impression. He says, I truly desire that all Christians would love and regard as worthy the lovely gift of music, which is precious, worthy, and costly treasure given to mankind by God. The riches of music are so excellent, so precious, that words fail me whenever I attempt to discuss and describe them. Blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. It finishes with this. A person who gives this some thought and yet does not regard music as a marvelous creation of God must be a clodhopper indeed. And does not deserve to be called a human being. He should be permitted to hear nothing but the braying of asses and the grunting of hogs. So I think Luther was fun to be around when it came to music. Then I looked at Calvin. Slightly different approach. Calvinists seem to have the approach that how can we improve on what God has given us in the Scripture? Therefore, we should only sing the Psalms. And we should only sing the tune, therefore we won't have harmonies or instruments. It doesn't sound like there was quite so much fun around. However, he did take the precaution of when he assembled these songs that he hired the best poets and musicians to set the psalms so people to use. But there were downsides to this because he brought in a musician called, let me try his name, Louis Bourgeois. What a great name. It's Bourgeois. Louis Bourgeois. And Louis Bourgeois was one of the musicians that set these tunes to be used. But he got thrown into prison because he changed 3 of the notes in one of the tunes. And he was in prison until Calvin managed to intercede and get him out. I don't know if you knew that. So it doesn't sound like that was a lot of fun. Then there was another. So that was Geneva. And then meanwhile in Zurich, there's another reformer. You see, I'm still trying to gather this information before I think I get this theology of music that Chuck's invited me to share with you. Bishop Murphy, sorry. In Zurich, there's a guy called Zwingli. He looked at the whole problem, the whole issue of how we use music in worships. He came to the conclusion that we shouldn't. He decided that for suitable worship, all you needed was the preaching of the word and the listening to the word. Okay, not much difference between those 3 then. So I decided it would take a braver man than me, or, yeah, that's right, somebody probably more foolish, to try and come up with a theology of worship when those people could not come to an agreement. In fairness, when I look at Zwingli, I think his decision not to add music was probably a reaction to what the Catholic Church was doing at the time, where they didn't have the preaching of the word, but they just had music. So you can see where those guys come from. But of course, this is a whole issue when it comes to music in church. It never changes. And I don't think we'll ever really come to an agreement about it because taste and style are involved, particularly taste. And this is a great dilemma. It's interesting, isn't it, that in the New Testament we don't have a fixed guideline of what we should do musically. I'm not quite sure if you're probably aware of this, but you know when Paul speaks about psalms, hymns and spiritual songs, he's not talking about the hymn book in your pew. I think some people think that it was. They didn't have it then. But sometimes we quote that scripture if that's what it means. Sometimes we quote that scripture if it's some sort of prescribed formula of the balance of things we're going to have. You know, psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. You know, that must mean, oh, God, our help in ages past, the rock of ages. Surely that's what Paul was talking about. I heard Gordon Fee talking about this once. You know Professor Gordon Fee? Is he a name that's known over here? And it was a fantastic talk. Unfortunately, it wasn't recorded, so I've only got my notes, which is a shame. He was talking to a small group of us, worship leaders. And he said it's quite interesting because he was describing this thing, the weight people attach to this. We must have psalms, hymns, or spiritual songs. He says, interesting enough, the word there, which is used, those three words, the word that's used to translate into psalms at the beginning can actually mean psalms or hymns or spiritual songs. And the word that's used to describe hymns, well, can actually mean psalms or hymns or spiritual songs. And the word that's used to describe spiritual songs can actually mean... and the hymns they mean there was really, it comes from a Greek word. It's to do with songs about a hero. And so sometimes we think it's just got to have that pattern in there. We lose something. So we're going to come back to that. That's right. I'm not used to speaking with the spotlight in my eye, so I can't quite see what I got down in the notes here. So we'll see how we get on. But I think the truth is the church was born singing. Have you ever heard that expression? The epistles, the New Testaments, is peppered with extracts from songs, where the writers of the epistle are quoting bits of the songs they sang. Are you aware of that? I mean, that bit from Philippians 2, where Paul says, may our attitude be as that of Christ. And then he goes, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. He's quoting a song that they sang as the early church. I think that's fantastic. Imagine being a songwriter in the early church, and your words that you wrote as a song become scripture. That's fantastic, the responsibility of that. And I talk to worship leaders about that. But that's what is happening. And I think the church was born singing. And sometimes we've lost sight of that. And again, Gordon Fee, I heard him say this, because I think sometimes people look at what Paul, when he writes to people, and he kind of, it sounds like he's writing to encourage them to dial down what they're doing. The reason probably he was doing that is because it was chaos. I mean, everybody brought a song, everybody was praying, everybody was with a prophecy. And Gordon Fee said, probably if we were a fly on the wall at one of Paul's original early church meetings, we would wonder if we were at a Christian meeting, because it was so, over the top. But he said the sad thing was, if Paul is now a fly on the wall in a lot of our Christian meetings today, he might wonder the same thing, because it's so quiet and dialed down. It wasn't what he was used to. But I think the church was born singing. But I think there has been an issue over the history of the church. I'm going to have to generalize a lot because we're covering a lot of ground in one time. But there has been an issue as things progress. I think part of why the church is born singing is interesting. Each time there's a big renewal, a big revival, a big move of God, like a rediscovering of the love for God, often there's an explosion of music and creativity that goes with it, isn't it? You notice the revivals, there's often a whole new set of music comes out of that. And that makes sense, because that's what we're like as humans. Who remembers ever falling in love first time? Your heart is full of song, isn't it? Even the most tuneless of us feel like we want to sing. You know the Beatles song? There were birds all around. I never heard them singing until there was you. And it's like, love does that to us. When we fall in love, that's what it first like. We may have forgotten that. And love changes. We only have the one word for love. You know all that stuff. We only have the one word for love. So it does change, and our love modifies. But when there's that initial passion there, it's like makes us want to sing and burst in song. And that's what it's been like for the church. When there's a new falling in love with God on a massive scale, there's an explosion of excitement. And people can't wait to sing. And often it's the laity, just really want to express themselves singing. They don't really care what they want to sing. They just want to sing to God because he means so much. But of course the leadership would rather have some other means of what the song, what the music is used for. Perhaps instruction, perhaps goes well with a sermon or something like that. So it's often we've had this tension, if you like, between what the leadership would like music to be for the church and what the laity really would like as an expression. And we see it historically happening. And throughout the history of the church, we've had the issues that's gone with that. And we forget we can stand up and sing a song now, and we're in a place of wonderful freedom. But it's not always like that. There has been, throughout the history of the church, there were times they argued about whether they should have instruments. They had arguments about whether they should have harmony. They even had serious discussions about which notes in the stave you were allowed to sing. Because they considered some notes were proper and other notes were sensuous. No, seriously. I mean, people fought and argued and probably sometimes died over this stuff. And then they argued about whether they should have a harmony, and then how elaborate music should be. And of course, all the people just want to express their praise to God. And it seems to me like, if you look back across the history of the church, it's as if the church has had a love-hate relationship with music. Let me qualify that. Partly because of this thing of trying to understand what it is. I think it's because it's as if the church has wanted to have the advantage of what music brings, but if we can do it somehow without anybody actually enjoying it. Because music, as we know, leads to pleasure, or gives us pleasure. And pleasure, as any good Puritan among you will know, leads to sin. So if somehow we can take the pleasure out of music, we can use it. So I think that's why there's been these big discussions over the history of the church. Well, what notes can we sing? What notes can we sing? And sometimes when I talk to worship teams and worship leaders, I say, look, don't take this too lightly. You know, we have a fantastic price of privilege, but it is a price. Someone's paid enormously for this over the years. And it's interesting because there's a pattern seems to happen. I mean, again, bear with me, I'm generalizing enormously, but you know, sometimes when you generalize in general, that's pretty close to what happened. But I'm generalizing enormously. A pattern sort of seemed to develop. You'd have a sort of basic singing by the congregation, songs that people sang, you know, like, and the outpouring of them. And then over a period of time, the songs that would get written would get better, you know, because this is the problem. You have musicians are creative people. You know, they just get bored with whatever is going on and will always try to stretch the boundaries, right? Anybody got a music team here? Know that? You know what your music team, even in your own church, is like that. Oh, I've sung that 2 weeks. I want to do something different. So they're always trying to stretch the boundaries. But that's a good thing. That's something God's put in us. You know, we're made in the image of God. God is a creative God. And I know sometimes it can be stretched out, but not what we want. But this pattern seemed to emerge, you know, as the church sang, and it was in the voice of the people, and then over a period of time, songs would get better and a little bit more clever. And so you'd find the better singers and the better musicians to do those songs because they were a bit better, a bit harder. And then, of course, you had better musicians and better songs and better singers. You could write slightly more difficult music that they could do. But then they weren't quite good enough, so you probably have to bring in professional singers to help to make it sound better. And then, so that you could write better music for time. You know, I'm talking about hundreds of years here. And then you could write better music, and then it was sounding fantastic. But the only thing that was kind of spoiling it was the congregation singing it. So let's stop the congregation singing it, and then it would sound better. And then, of course, you get fantastic stuff to being written, and then you can decide, well, actually, the music is sacred by itself. So if we write good enough music, we'll reach this pure state of worship, you know, as long as you're joined in a sublime way. And so the congregation is asked not to sing. And this happens several times, I think, even as early as in Laodicea, in 366, 367, they decreed we're only going to sing the Psalms and the congregation mustn't sing. As early as that. It was a dark day in the church, I think. And then what happens is someone comes along, or the Spirit of God seems to move somebody, and they come along and they say, this is not right. If it's congregational worship, it's worship. We need to be singing this. It needs to be you guys out there singing these words. So you get an explosion of revival. You get these new songs written, and it gets back into the voice of the people. And then after a while, we start writing better songs. You see the pattern. And I think that's what's happening. But some of you might be ahead of me here and thinking, well, where are we now in that cycle? Which is quite interesting. Because although the music is not quite as classically as it used to be, it's interesting that nowadays at big events, you almost have to have a professional band and a big show. But it's interesting. So I wonder if the same patterns happening. I'm slightly aware of that because I'm also slightly responsible for it happening, having produced these records.